Okay, awesome. Thanks, Max. Great to see everybody. Hope you're all doing well. I am just popping in to say hello as usual and remind you of the career coaching parts of the class. So you should be wrapping up all the modules, finishing your draft assignments. If you're keeping up with that, we are going to be meeting that last week, or the week before last, to go over all the career coaching stuff and catch up on resumes, cover letters, all those things if you have not gotten a chance to do them. So that's okay. If you do have questions, though, always feel free to message me. Or if you just want to say, hey, can you take a quick look at this? Like I say, I always just ask that you try to watch the current module so that I'm not telling you all the same thing from my mouth every time. And the next group meetings are this week. So it's Friday at 5 is one of the options. And the other option is Saturday morning at 11. And that will be my personal Zoom link, not this one. So it'll get shared. I think it's already shared in the career coaching channel, but I'll reshare it again before those classes. So it's easy to find. So this will be, I think, our last one before we meet in person. So I wanted to see if there was any specific topics that you guys want to talk about in that. Otherwise, I will focus it on kind of getting us started for that last week. And I also want to talk to you guys about finding mentors and people to help assist you and bridge you on getting to the end of this cohort and out into the real world again. So if you have any ideas or thoughts on what you want to talk about, go ahead and share them with me now, or you can message them later if you don't want to share them now.
Just as a reminder, this is the beginning of week 19 of 24. So week 24, the very last week of the program, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, we save for like last minute capstone questions. But you are lucky enough to round out the cohort with Laura on week 23, right? So that is September 23rd to the 26th. We have common space reserved, so we're encouraging everyone to attend in person for that week if possible. And Laura's going to walk you through all of the modules that you already have access to on Canvas. But this is one of those things that you don't want to wait until last minute and then go, oh, I've done 22 weeks of the code part. Now I need to do the career part all last minute, right? So you want to be thinking about, hey, the end of this education opportunity is right around the corner. How do I transition myself into career mode? The job market is really intimidating. Getting a cover letter, getting a resume, getting your portfolio site up to date, right? There's a lot of work that has to be done there. So don't save that all the way up until September 23rd and then go, oops, end of the cohort. I got to go do all of that career stuff, right? So now's the perfect opportunity to kind of plant that seed, ask Laura any questions you may have, start thinking about, hey, what other training opportunities do I really want to get my career started, so that when the 23rd does roll around in September, Laura has some time to prep for it.
Right. And like Max said, it's ideal if you don't wait till last week, but if you do wait till the last week, that's also okay. Don't want to pressure you guys too much if you want to focus on your capstone and making it to the end of this with your code skills intact. But if you can get started, it's even just thinking about it, just having an idea of what it is you need to do, looking at the assignments and understanding what happens. So there is a question from Joe. What expectations? Oh, I lost the chat. It didn't show me the whole thing. Hold on.
What expectations should I have for entering the job market?
You should expect that it's going to be as challenging as this cohort has been. It's not easy because you're putting yourself out there with a different set of skills that you probably have not talked about before. So that's one of the challenges, is imposter syndrome, and really getting comfortable telling people that you can do this and that you're willing to learn and keep learning. Then there is the need to keep learning. You've learned a lot, but there's a lot more to go into the individual areas that you want to go into. So if you're picking a specific tech skill, you're probably going to have to build more on that skill. So if you're looking at doing database, you're going to have to keep building database skills. And if you're looking at doing websites, you're going to have to keep trying them and doing them. They're all different platforms and programs and nuances when you get into a specific company's data and tech and their stack and help whatever they use. So there's a imposter syndrome aspect, there's the continuous learning aspect, there is also just who do you reach out to, getting in touch with people and in the constant no's and rejection. So that is another part of it. It's it's a different kind of stress than you're probably going through now. But it's still a real one. And so having what our goal is to have these tools for you. So that's not the thing you're worrying about. You're worrying about making the connections, getting the interviews and those sort of things. We want you to be prepared to be at that level by the time you leave.
And that's such a hard thing to understand, as finishing an educational course, right? And thinking like, all right, I'm ready to go. And you get to employers, and employers who are hiring entry level and junior level developers do not expect you to come in and know everything, right? And part of their interviewing process is usually testing you to see how you take feedback, how you push yourself to learn, right? You've got so much momentum built up of everything that it's taken to get through this 6-month program. That's what you want to bring into your interviews, is that enthusiasm to learn, because it's very easy to kick yourself and beat yourself up and go, I didn't do well on that technical interview. Well, if you push back a little bit and go, well, no, I showed that I was willing to learn. I asked questions. I froze up, but I burst through that. I tried to do my best there. That's what employers are looking for. And it's so hard to keep that momentum up and keep that confidence up, but you have to keep doing it, right? COVID has completely changed the remote world. The number of opportunities available to you locally is a lot bigger, but remote has gone crazy. The applying for a job, it's not 5 other people who have applied for that job, it's 5,000 people have applied for that remote job, right? So how do you stand out? How do you keep that momentum going? But to Laura's point, just showing that you're willing to learn is so important, because employers do not expect you to know everything by the end of a boot camp or by the end of a 4-year college degree or any of that. Technology is constantly changing, and because of that, we have to be constantly learning, and companies are expecting that when they are hiring developers.
Exactly. If you can think of it as like gates, there's different gates you have to get through to get to the next level, like a game. The first gate is getting your application seen. The second gate is getting someone to put it in the interview table. Third gate is getting somebody to talk to you on the phone, and you get to the second level where they invite you for the interview. So you have to, it's a step-by-step process. It doesn't seem like it because you're applying for jobs all over the place and they're all going to be at different stages, but the expectation there is just that it's going to be a lot of work, and you'll have to keep going and find ways to stay motivated and positive. And really continuing your education is a great way to do that, because you're continuing to be in a space with other people who are learning. You're still feeling those wins of like learning something new and building your confidence. So highly recommend that, you don't take very long before jumping into another class or some other online opportunity or something to keep building your skills. And I do want to say, Max, I talked to Jesse and we decided to do the career week virtually this time.
Noted. I will update that on the schedule. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. We had not relayed that information to you. We talked about the options and decided that just doing everybody virtual might be a little bit better than splitting the difference.
No problem. Yeah, students are used to the virtual, so totally understand.
Yeah. So, okay. Any other questions or concerns? I can answer any quick questions anybody has right now. Shadia, if you submitted your stuff to me, I'm going to take a look at it tomorrow.
And Terry, go ahead with your question.
Yeah, I was looking at the assignments, and one of the assignments was the action plan. Are we required to do that one? Or
That's a great question. So the action plan is actually the only thing that's required to turn in, which is a little surprising, but it is the one thing. Some of you may not be ready to finish your resume or may not be ready to finish your cover letter. So my goal is to get you to a point where you would know how to do it yourself. And I'm technically kind of still available after the cohort. So if you, for instance, one of the past cohort graduates was in the middle of another class, so she wasn't ready to finish her resume because she wanted to get that on there after she had graduated, or not in a class, but in a university program. So she wanted to finish her resume later. So I wasn't going to hold it against her that it wasn't finished. And then, but the action plan is the thing that tells us what are you planning to do when this is over. So it's not only accountability tool for you, but it is a checkpoint for us to know that you have something that will guide you on what are you doing. So you don't necessarily have, you could start it now if you want to, but that one we actually can do in class. And I want to make sure that you guys have it filled out, because it says it's got 3 categories, and it says networking, applying, and learning, all the things we were just talking about. So it's a guide for you to say, this is what I plan to do, how many resumes I plan to submit, how many calls I plan to make, how many companies I plan to research when the cohort is over. So you have a guide to keep going that you can give to your friend, you can give to your family member, someone else can help hold you accountable if you want a mentor, and say, this is my plan.
And another thing, is it possible for me to like have a cover letter, but have the cover letter be like kind of like a dummy cover letter until I apply for like this one specific job? Let's just say Google, and then I could just like look at it through Google, and then I could just copy like kind of like the cover letter to another cover letter, so I can send that to Google, plus add like stuff that would, you know, help me out with the Google job.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So there's kind of like 2 different approaches you can do on the cover letter. You can, maybe even 3, you can do a template that is to nobody and just leave those areas blank, you know, so you can say, dear hiring managers at nothing, I'm applying for the job blank. You can do it that way where it's template. You can do it where you're pretending to apply to Google, and then you can do it to where you're actually applying to something you've seen online. So any one of those 3 ways to get you started is fine.
And cover letters vary importance at different employers, right? So when you're applying to a big employer, they may not even require a cover letter, or they may take your cover letter and then never look at it, right? Compared to when I was hiring at a 4-person company becoming a 10-person company, I didn't even look at resumes. I looked at cover letters first, and if you did not put our company name in your cover letter, you were instantly rejected, because I wanted to know why you were excited to work for us specifically. And so I always prioritize cover letter first and then resume second, right? I wanted to know that you opened our website, knew what the first sentence was on the website, and included it in the cover letter, right? I didn't need anything super specific. I just wanted to know that you had tailored your cover letter to the job you were applying for. Again, that's for a 4-person company, right? When you look at a company like Microsoft or Google or any of the huge companies, they use something called ATS, application tracking software or systems. And they're actually using AI to parse through your resume, to pull your cover letter apart, to give you some kind of automated score that then recruiters go in, take the top percentage, and then use that. So different strategies for different jobs that you're applying for and how big the job is. And that is what is so what I find so frustrating about the job market, is that I can have one opinion and Laura can have another, and a recruiter may have a third, and none of them are wrong, but one of them is better for that company than the other, right? So these are all opinions. These are all tactics that we have used to get jobs, that we are trying to help teach you to get you jobs. But at the end of the day, you got to follow what makes sense to me, right? What is going to make my resume stand out? What is going to get me the job? What has worked? And that's what Laura's Career Week will be all about, of her teaching all of the things that she has found to be successful.
Great. You're absolutely right, because I do the same thing. I'm going to read the cover letter, and if it doesn't have my company name in it, even if you didn't put my name on it and I told you what my name is, I don't want to work with you. That's just rude. So there's a lot of little things people, I think, don't get picked for, that they don't realize that's why they're not getting picked. Even the way you build your LinkedIn. So those are the kind of things I will teach you guys. I just worked with someone who hired me to do a cover letter for a once in a lifetime internship opportunity to work on an island in Hawaii. She wanted it bad, and she got it. And so it's a little bit of evidence that I know what I'm talking about. So I think I do enjoy helping people with resumes and cover letters, especially the cover letters. You know, people are using ChatGPT, and I don't think that you should not use it, but there are ways to use it correctly. I can easily tell when a cover letter has been written with ChatGPT and not been altered. And I think hiring managers probably couldn't tell for a little while, but now that they've seen them over and over, they can tell it's the same exact formula that everyone is getting. So you want to be able to avoid that. You want to be able to take advantage of AI, but then avoid that pitfall where it's just clear, painfully obvious that you didn't write it yourself. So we'll cover all of those things. And then Max, I think there was another question in the chat or something.
Joe said, so what you're saying is one of each type of approach.
Well, and there is a little bit of trial and error to everything. You know, it's hard to see. You want to put your best effort into everything, but then there's also like the jobs you really, really want, put it extra effort into. The ones that you're like, man, I'll use this as a practice, maybe not put in as much effort so you can focus your time on the other things. And we will talk about that too, the different approaches, all that stuff. Try to give you all the best tools that you can have to land your job with these skills possible.
Yeah, and I think a really good example of that is my resume. I have two versions of my resume, always a PDF. I will take anyone's feedback, but always a PDF. I will tell you you are wrong if it's any format other than a PDF. But other than that, I've got two copies of my resume, and one has all of the logos of all the applications I know how to use, right? And my argument for that is that there's a different part of your brain that triggers when you see an image compared to the text of that application, right? And I had a recruiter come back and tell me that my resume was terrible because no ATS software would be able to parse out those logos and actually be able to identify what was on my resume. And I came back and I said, that's actually intentional. I'm not applying for companies that have thousands of employees that are using AI to filter through them. I don't want to work at any of those companies. I don't want those recruiters coming to me and telling me that. I want to work at a smaller company. So I intentionally foiled my resume, right? To say, hey, I don't want those kinds of jobs. But that's because I'm at a senior developer level, right? Where I get the opportunity to go through that. But I got that feedback so many times that I actually built a second version of my resume that does have that text listed out, right? So if there is a big company rolling through, or if I am applying for a big company, I have that in my back pocket, and it's just a matter of selecting which file that I upload. So there is definitely something to be said about playing multiple games or trying multiple approaches. So Joe, you're totally right there.
Yeah. And there's definitely an element of just fate. You know, you have no control over who's looking at your stuff. It's ATS or not ATS, or what mood a person is in the day they're looking at your stuff. And you know, the best that you can do is put in your best effort every time and do your best. And then but there's still like the tips and tricks for standing out and all of that, which we'll go over. So all good points. And I think, you know, everybody should be ready to jump into class now. We will go over all the stuff. If this brought up any more questions, we can talk about them at group this Friday and on Saturday morning. So I hope I'll see you at least at one of those.
And if any questions pop up, you can always throw them in the Slack channel as well and go through them in the Zoom meetings.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Laura, for popping in. Sorry for extending it.
Yeah. Oh, no, you're fine. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Laura.
Bye.
So obviously the you know, we talk about careers in code, we have the modules for you on Canvas, but I really try to emphasize, right, that the careers and the code, obviously two very important parts of our names. And the feedback that we've had from previous cohorts is, hey, it's really hard to focus on my career at the same time it is learning all of this code stuff, right? It's hard to juggle both. But we are reaching that tipping point, right? Where the code stuff, yeah, we got to keep going on that, but that will come to an abrupt end, right? Once we get up to that career week, once we finish week 22, it's like, oh, now I got to go apply all of this stuff and go get an actual job out of it. So you do want to be thinking about slowly ramping the time that you're spending up on that, making sure that you have the Canvas assignments submitted if you're up to it, making sure that you're ready to kind of flip a different switch in your brain and go, hey, I'm going into week 23. We're going into that career module. What's it going to take for me to actually get a job out of all of that? And that's why we bring Laura in to help you transition into that job market. So we don't completely go away at the end of week 24. I personally offer one-on-ones, 30 minutes a month for graduates, for alumni, so that you guys can check in with me, whether that is code related, right? Of, hey, I keep on working on my capstone. I've made progress here, whatever it is. You get to control that 30-minute one-on-one, take it wherever you want. You can debrief about job interviews that you've had, about what you think didn't go well, right? You can debrief about the types of jobs you're applying for. You can do technical mock interviews after the program. However you want to use that 30 minutes a month is completely up to you. But we are less available, right? Throughout the program, there's really an unlimited number of one-on-ones that you can book. So taking advantage of that while you are in the program, because we hear resoundingly from students that Thursday graduation feels surreal, feels like it didn't actually happen, and Monday rolls around and it's muscle memory at 5:30 to join that Zoom link. And we're not here, right? And so we encourage you guys to stay in touch. I know previous cohorts have kind of set up like a once a month get together, talk about what they're going through, what jobs they're applying to, what code resources that they're learning, all of that. We encourage you to keep that community together, but I want you guys to start thinking about that. Hey, we are now roughly 1 month away from graduation, a little bit more, but not by much. So start thinking about that for sure. Any questions that I can answer? Granted, not Laura, and Laura, you'll have a chance to ask those questions on Friday and Saturday, or take advantage of the Slack channel as well, especially if it's a question that you want to give Laura some heads up time to, kind of prepare for. Definitely use the Slack channel, but we'll leave the door open now. Any questions that you guys have specifically for me?
I guess my question for you is like, what was it like when you first, I guess, applied for like a tech job or have like those technical interviews, I suppose?
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very good question. So, I can give you guys some insight into my first tech job, which, believe it or not, I am still at 9 years later. So I did internships all through college. I took every opportunity that I had the chance to get hands-on experience. So, I faced imposter syndrome at every single one of those jobs. So I did an internship at AOL. I did an internship at StartFast Code. I'm sorry, StartFast Venture Accelerator, which was a bunch of tech companies building products from scratch. And then the third summer, I did a program with the Tech Garden for building my own app. And how we, support for getting your business started kind of from scratch. And so the first interview that I had with my boss, really the only interview that I had with my boss, I sat down with them. I had my resume printed out. Believe it or not, there's something called resume paper, which is complete BS. And fortunately, the industry has moved away from that. But at one point in time, there was a special paper quality that had a watermark behind it that you were supposed to print your resume on. I couldn't make that up if I tried. No one actually checks for that now, but back in the day, I guess recruiters would like print out your resume and like hold the paper up to the sun and be like, "Oh, this doesn't have a watermark on it. Couldn't be a good resume." Complete and utter bullshit. But this was a decade ago, so anyway, um so I sat down with him and I'm prepared to have like a, full out interview. And he goes, "You want a beer? I'm going to order a beer." And I'm like, "Oh, okay. This is not going to be an interview that I'm used to." And so he's, quizzing me on this stuff. And he goes, and I said, "You haven't asked me any questions about my education or my grades or, kind of how I got this knowledge." And he was like, "Listen, you've built three different applications, one of which is on the App Store. You pulled out your phone and you showed me how the application works. So why do I care how you've learned the content? You have shown me that you already know what it takes to build an application that you can actually show me that is working. And, he asked me questions about, well, how do you do project management? How do you prioritize features? How are you communicating with your customers to figure out what to build next? All questions that I actually had experience doing because I went out and I didn't just build an app, I got it out in front of customers, I got their feedback, and I was working not only as a software developer should be working, but I was also had real world experience of that application, right? And so he hired me. And that was really, really crazy for me. And in the first month or so, we ran into all different kinds of communication issues. So the first thing that we ran into was he was loading up this project management tool, and I had no fucking idea what he was asking me to do. Like literally no clue. Right. And it took me a week, and I finally got back to him and I'm like, I don't think I can do that because I don't know what you're asking me to do. And he sat down and we pulled up the software and he said, this should be doing this thing. And I said, oh, so you need the database model to be updated to store the information of that new form field. And he went, oh, yeah, I haven't written software code in 30 years. So the terms that I'm using are 30 years old, and that's why you don't understand what I'm asking you to do. Major imposter syndrome there because I thought, no way I'm going to be able to do this job. I don't know what my boss is asking me to do. And all it took was me saying, hey, when we sit down and we do our 2-week sprint planning, be prepared for you to say something and then ask for follow-up questions before you just throw that my way and give me 2 weeks to spin my wheels and not make any progress on it. I need to be the one typing it into the software, not you. I need to be the one who is understanding what task you're asking me to do as the one who has to do it. And he was like, oh, yeah, of course, no problem. Like, that makes total sense. But it took me time to get there, right? The other major thing that I want to call out there is that you will be inheriting code. There's a 90% chance that you will be coming into the company and they will not be saying from square one, build this new thing from scratch. That doesn't happen at companies. You're getting hired at a company, and that company has existing software they've built. They probably have a team of engineers that you're going to be integrating with. They're going to be using tools that you haven't used before. Just because you use VS Code does not mean that company is going to use VS Code. Just because you learn JavaScript doesn't mean that the company is going to be using JavaScript, right? So there is a learning period at any company that you go into, but you also have to understand that there is a lot of knowledge at that company that may not be documented. So when you come into a company, you're not going to hit the ground running. You're not going to add a feature on day one. You're not even going to be done with your computer setup on day one. You're still going to be creating accounts. You're still going to be getting access to documentation. You're still going to be understanding what the products are doing. You're still going to be understanding where there's technical debt and where someone took a shortcut and now you got to go pay the price for that. And that's all on the technical side. None of that is on, I'm working at a new company. I have to learn the names of all those people. I have to learn their titles. I have to learn what departments they're on. A great thing to ask for is what is called an org chart or an organization chart, where they give you a breakdown of, hey, these 3 people are in marketing. These 4 people are in development, but this person in development is actually our quality assurance person. Right? Because oftentimes you're going to have a question and you're not going to know who to ask the question of. Well, that comes with time, right? But there are things that you can ask for because hopefully, chances are you're not going to be the first hire at that company. So that imposter syndrome gets beaten down, gets shrunken when you know, hey, I have to ask questions here. I'm not going to be expected to know this out of the gate. It is expected that I am going to go through a learning period through this, right? That I am going to be not expected to make that feature work on day one or on week one or even on or month one sometimes, right? It takes time to learn. It takes time to get up to speed at that company. And so the last tangent that I will go down here is my first internship at AOL. They gave me this feature and they said, this is what we need done. And it was in a language I had a subset of a language I had never worked with before called Groovy. And I was just really struggling, right? And I got all the way down in the code and I finally found the section of the code that they were asking me to add something to, and I was lost. I just was like, I don't know how to do this, right? And so I took a step back and I said, can you provide me the documentation for this software? And they gave me basically the equivalence of the API reference, right? And we've looked at the API reference in SQLize, and it's all of these objects, and it's all of these parameters, and it's in a syntax that I don't fucking understand. And I'm just like, this may as well be in Latin, right? Like I don't, this is no help to me, right? And so I took a step back and I said, can you give me the user guide? And they said, we don't have one. So what do you mean you don't have a user guide? What happens when someone gets hired who is using this software, not on the development team, but is actually using this software? And they said, oh, Jim trains them downstairs on how to use all of this. I said, well, can I have a meeting with Jim and can Jim train me on that? And my manager was like, no, Jim's not a developer. And I said, but you want me to build a feature into a piece of software that's so complex that only Jim knows how to train people on it. So why are you asking me to add something new to a piece of software that I don't understand how to use? I can't add something new to something I don't know how to do. And they were like, oh, that's a good point. So they sent me downstairs and I had an hour-long training session with Jim. And that was like all the doors had opened for me. And I'm like, oh, now I understand not only what this software is supposed to do, but how to use it. So now I can figure out why it works the way it does and ultimately get down to that code level. So kicking myself, spent a week just, understanding the code, not making any progress. I had that light bulb moment. I got trained on the software. And a week and a half later, 2.5 weeks into the whole job, I got the feature done. And I was really worried that, oh, I'm not cut out for this. I don't know why they hired me. Somehow I made it through the cracks. I don't know why they gave me this opportunity. I really didn't think I was going to be able to do it. I had that mindset for the full 2.5 weeks. I did have that final light bulb moment. I finally got it done. And I went back to my manager and I said, it's done. What's next? And he said, what do you mean it's done? And I said, well, this feature, you asked me to get it done. I went through the training. I added this code here. I checked it into Git. It's finished. And he came back to me and he said, that feature was supposed to take you all summer and you got it done in 2.5 weeks. Lesson learned: if you were assigned a task, ask how long they expect that task to take you. Because I was kicking myself having that imposter syndrome, not thinking that I was able to do this at all, let alone to get it done in a reasonable time frame. And my manager had screwed up and not told me how long that was supposed to take. So I spent the rest of the summer writing better documentation so the next person who comes in was able to understand not only that product, but all the other products that our team was responsible for working on. So when you have that imposter syndrome, realize that there are so many different things that can be causing that imposter syndrome and say, hey, am I making progress on this? Because oftentimes you can feel like you're not fitting in or that you're not able to do this. But when you take a step back and go, well, I'm actually not able to do this, but I'm learning more every day. I'm finishing these sections. I'm being able to complete these courses. I'm able to understand more of the code. I know who to go for questions now. That is all part of the onboarding experience at a company, where it's not just learning or progress in the code itself, it's learning how to work at a company. And that, I think, is super, super important. Before I read Joe's question in the chat, any questions about that stuff? Okay. Joe said, you may not have direct experience with this, but how do you cope or deal with the emotional toll of repeat application rejections? In other words, how do you keep a positive mindset when competing, not just with professionals in your area, but in the country and around the world? Great question. The US by far pays engineers more than any other country. So I applied for a job in Canada, and they said, hey, you're a US applicant. Are you aware of the pay gap between our two countries? And I'm like, no, I'm not, kind of naively saying that. And the recruiter was like, yeah, there's about a 30% difference between what we pay engineers in the US and what the rest of other first world countries pay engineers. So that is one thing to think of. And a lot of that is because you will be working in a team. And even if there isn't a language gap, there is a cultural gap between working with engineers in other countries, right? So that's one of the reasons US companies pay engineers a lot more. The remote world, especially probably more so for engineering than any other field, has turned the job application market on its head, because software engineers, unless it is Department of Defense, unless you are working for military or a military adjacent company like Lockheed Martin, who has some very strict security requirements, there is a 90% chance that you can do your job fully remote. Whether or not the company allows for that is a different story, right? But because of that, a lot of job opportunities, companies have realized either, hey, we are paying a lot for office space and we want our employees in the company. And for junior developers in particular, I think there's something to be said for that, right? There is something to be said about, I have a question, and instead of messaging someone and waiting for them to happen to check their Slack, I can walk over to their desk and say, hey, do you have a minute? I'm working on this code. I'm stuck here. Can you help me out? That's less true for senior developers, I personally think. But everyone is on a spectrum of how well they think remote employees work. We've been remote for 6 years now, since before the pandemic, and so I'm a little biased there. And then I have found that we have better success in careers in code when we are almost fully remote, and even when we do offer in-person offerings, very few people attend. So I am probably the most biased person you can ask about the impacts of remote work. I am very pro remote work. However, the downside to remote work is now that you are remote, you're not competing with all of the engineers in Syracuse, which may be a couple hundred or low thousands. You are now competing with everyone, at least in the country, if not globally as well, right? And so I will say that outsourcing your code as a company, hiring engineers outside of the country generally has a negative reputation, because on paper it looks like a great way to save money. But most companies, I would say, usually regret outsourcing and end up spending more money hiring their own in-house team to fix mistakes that the outsourced team did. And that outsourcing usually is outside of the country. that's a sweeping generalization. It certainly does not hold true in every case. So take that with a grain of salt. The reason why I'm bringing all of that up is how do you keep that positive mindset when competing with people around the country or around the world? You're going to get a lot of rejections, right? The problem with applying for a job is when you used to apply for a job, you filled out an application that was specific to that company. You sent it into that company's website or in person, and then a person took that application, processed it, and decided to move you on or not. Those days are gone. Unless you're applying for an actual local Syracuse company, chances are when you apply for the job, you're going to go on LinkedIn, you're going to go on Indeed, you're going to go on Monster. You're going to fill out one universal application, and there's going to be a link of 20 buttons on the page, and you can go to each one of them without even reading the job description and just spam the apply button all the way down the page. And if you can do that, 1,000 other people can do that, and they will just apply and apply and apply. So they call that the spray and pray method of applying to jobs, because you are spraying your resume everywhere and just praying that someone will read your resume and go, hey, let's actually interview this person. Or even worse, you're hoping that their ATS, their application tracking system, will flag you as a decent applicant, and Laura will teach you, kind of how to do that with your resume, and just hoping that they pick you. That's one method. I know people who have gotten jobs that way. It does work sometimes. The other method is saying, hey, I'm going to be a thorn in their side, or I'm going to find a clever way to get my foot in the door. So I'm going to go onto LinkedIn. I'm going to find some engineer that works at the company who's local in Syracuse, or maybe even not, and say, hey, I'm going to find their email address, or I'm going to message them on LinkedIn and say, hey, I'm really interested in your company. I'm a boot camp developer or a boot camp graduate who is learning more about the industry. I would love to hear more about your day to day. Can I buy you a coffee at Cafe Kubal or at Freedom of Espresso or some local place, right? It's not to get a job there. You are literally meeting with someone, putting yourself out there, saying, hey, I'd love to learn more about your position, because now you have your foot in the door at the company. If you can do that with a recruiter, great. But even better if you can do it with a developer, do it with a manager, do it with someone who you go, hey, I could be working with you one day. Let me go learn more about your job. And then slip in questions like that. Have a list of questions ready of, well, when you are interviewing, even if you don't have a job position open right now, when you're interviewing, what is something that you look for? Or, hey, when you got started in your job post, what's something that you wish you knew at the beginning, right? And I always say this. This is a quote that I use all the time. An interview should feel more like a conversation, not an interrogation. If you walk out of an interview and they have asked 95% of the questions and you had one short little question at the end, you have failed that interview. People, when they are interviewing, are trying to gain a sense of, will I work well with this person or not? And if all they're doing is running through a list of questions, they're probably not going to feel like they're going to work well with you, right? So being prepared to actually gain the confidence when they ask a question, give an answer, and then have a follow-up question for them. Not a prepared list of questions to ask at the end. I'm saying actually have that list of questions, or actually, if a question pops in your head, find a way to work it into the interview. Because if they get to the end of 30 minutes or an hour and they go, oh my God, I only asked 3 of my questions because we were busy talking about all this other stuff, they're going to give you very high marks on that interview because it was just a natural back and forth conversation, right? That's how they know, oh, I could work with this person because I can just talk with them naturally, right? So those are all interview tips. But one thing that I would say, finally answering your question, not that I was trying to dodge it in the first place, is if the interviewers, if the companies, if where you're applying can use an application tracking system, why the hell can't you? So every job that you apply to, put it in a spreadsheet. Have that spreadsheet keep track of the recruiter's name and the email address. If you can find it, some places that you can't, right? Make sure you are keeping track of when you applied for the company, but then when you manually reached out to that company and said, hey, I applied 2 weeks ago. I was just checking in to see how your interviewing process was going. Don't need to be nasty. You don't need to say I was applicant number 123. Where am I in the queue? All you're doing is saying, "Hey, I'm a thorn in your side. I'm sticking out in your inbox. I'm just checking in, seeing how your interviewing process is going." That's a great way, right? Because now it doesn't just feel like you're applying to 1,000 jobs. It feels like you are working to get that job, right? Or to get the next step in the interview process. So I am a big fan of don't just go on Indeed and hit apply, 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 apply. Actually tailor that cover letter. Do some research on the company. Figure out if you would actually want to work there. And even if you're like, yeah, whatever, I'll work anywhere, still get excited about working at that job. Figure out what it takes to tailor that cover letter. Keep track of all of that in your spreadsheet. Actually reach out, see if you can find a phone number for the company and call the person 2 weeks later if you don't hear back on email. Send them a letter. Stop in locally, which is a little stalkerish, but they have an office address for a reason. See if you can get your foot in the door and be like, hey, I'd love to meet someone at the company. I'd love to learn more about what you guys are doing. Is there any chance, an opportunity to tour your facility or grab a coffee with someone in person? Send them a paper printout. No, you don't have to use the stupid resume paper, but send them a printout of your resume and your cover letter. Mail it in. Address it to HR. Find the hiring manager's name if you can. Put that right on the envelope so it gets to the right spot in their mailroom. All different tactics that you can do there, but my biggest advice there is follow up on it. LinkedIn and Monster and Indeed are going to make you feel like it's totally fine to hit the apply button 50 times. Don't do that, right? Yes, you can apply 50 times, but invest the extra effort into it, because if you feel like you're tracking it, that will be very helpful in terms of feeling like you are applying with no end in sight. Um, so that, and then I would also say, just because you are applying for jobs doesn't mean that you are done. Just because the boot camp is over at 24 weeks, just because you got your capstone to a point that allowed you to graduate, does not mean that you are done. So continue investing the time on your portfolio website, continue investing time in either your capstone or additional projects. Make sure that you are networking at every opportunity that you have, not only at OpenHack, but also at local career fairs. A lot of colleges have career fairs that are actually open to the public, that are not limited to just their students. And there are actually surprisingly a lot of a high number of career fairs that are not college run, right? So look into career fairs, make sure those are on your radar, make sure you're continuing to build projects, and then make sure that you are capable of talking about those projects as well, right? Because it doesn't do you any good if you walk in and you go, here's my app, have fun. You need to be enthusiastic about talking about it. You need to be prepared to answer questions about it. I'm not saying that you need to be a business person who's selling $1 million worth of subscriptions to your app. But if you go in and you say, here's this cool thing that I've built, be prepared to actually talk about that, right? Be prepared to have questions about why did you pick that database? What's your stack using? What are some problems that you've run into? What are the next features that you want to build? How do you deal with customer feedback? What did you learn while you were building all of this? What's the next app that you want to build? How much time are you spending investing into building this? what experience have you learned in this app that makes you think that you're the right fit for our company and working on our apps? Those are all great questions that I would want to ask of an applicant, whether it's an app that they're building on a personal project or whether that's an app that they've built at a previous company. I don't really care what the app is doing. All I want to know is, hey, is the skill set that you learned from that app transferable to what apps we are building in our company? Okay, Joe, go ahead with your follow-up.
So you mentioned the global market and how the US is disproportionately paying out salaries than the rest of the world is. Would you recommend then, despite some other hurdles for entry level professionals to, widen their range to somewhere like Australia or New Zealand or Canada, UK? Assuming you can get over the working paper hurdles.
Yeah, so I would say it works better the other way around, that you're more likely to get a job in the US because you are a US citizen or have US work authorization. And so there is less paperwork for the companies to do. And so you will find on a lot of those remote postings, it will say US work authorization required. Because they aren't actually limiting it to US citizens. What they're saying is we don't want to actually have to pay for your H-1B or other work authorization papers. I don't have a ton of experience applying to international jobs, except for the one that I applied for in Canada, where they did give me a heads up right at the beginning of the interview process that I would be taking roughly a 30% pay cut if I worked for that company in Canada. So I would say, I wouldn't say take any opportunity that is willing to pay you and get you experience, but pretty close to that, right? So there are a lot of job scams out there. You should not be giving your bank account information or your credit card information until it is payday, until they are like, hey, this is payroll. This is going through Paychecks or ADP or Gusto or, there are a ton of HR systems out there. But Google that HR system before you enter your bank account information. You definitely, at no point will they say, oh, we need to put a $1,500 deposit on your card because we're ordering the laptop that you need to do all of this work, but we'll pay for the laptop. Major scam, don't fall for that. There is a stupid form called is it the W9 or the I9? I always get the two mixed up. That it's it's the I9. The I9 is an employment verification form, and you have to send in your social and then your driver's license and passport or driver's license and social security card or birth certificate. That is actually legitimate. And HR does need a copy of that to be able to legally pay you. So those are not BS. But outside of that, if you feel like anything is shady, don't proceed. Ask questions, right? Like make sure that you feel comfortable with any of that. But there is a lot of opportunity of saying, hey, this is not my ideal salary. This is not where I want to be working for my entire career, but they're giving me an opportunity to get started. And oftentimes that comes in the form of contract work. You can learn a shitload by doing contract work. So I wouldn't say, I would say take opportunities that are presented to you, even if it is international, but also don't turn off your BS detector if something is feeling wrong. You don't want to go and take any opportunity just because it's presented to you. You do want to make sure that you're being cautious. And I will say the number of you're much more likely to have your identity stolen by credit card theft or by one of the data leaks that happened or any of that. It is pretty rare to go through an entire interview process and then not have the company be legit. But I actually know friend of a friend of a friend who actually went through that and did actually have identity theft happen there. So it is kind of crazy that you have to verify your social security number with your employer by just writing it down on a PDF and like emailing it to them. It sounds crazy, but that's shockingly the way that it's done. And yes, SSNs are a terribly insecure method, and your social security number has been leaked at some point somewhere on the internet, whether it was this last leak or not. It's out there. Which, friendly reminder to everyone, if you do have a social security number, make sure you freeze your credit. It is free. It takes 5 minutes to do at each agency. It takes 15 minutes total. All you got to do is answer a couple security questions. Do it at Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion. You have to do it at all three. You will either create a username or password or get a PIN after you do it. And all the credit freeze says is no one is allowed to open an account under my social security number unless I explicitly go back to all three agencies and unfreeze the credit. There is no cost to freeze it. There is no cost to unfreeze it. The only cost is your time, and 10 times more of your time if you don't remember your username, password, and PIN if they still do that. Most of them have moved over to a username and password system. So I highly recommend that everyone freeze their credit. If you have not frozen your credit, even if you think I'm not going to use my credit in years, what do I care? Because someone else could use your credit and turn into a nightmare of a situation to deal with identity theft and getting your credit fixed. So if you have not frozen your credit, freeze it. All it takes is 15 minutes to freeze it the first time. It takes maybe 3 minutes at each agency to unfreeze it if you do apply for your credit card or any other kind of loan or anything like that. So you have learned nothing throughout this cohort. Learn to freeze your credit. It is so, so important. And anyone who has a social security number, even if you don't have a credit history, can freeze their credit. If there's not enough data on you, they may ask you to actually mail in a copy of your license, a utility bill, or something that shows your address, and a form that's basically requesting that you freeze your credit if you don't have enough credit history. But the vast majority of people can freeze their credit online at all three agencies. So, just saying. And Joe, you're joking about a library card being more secure, but there is actually federal laws around when you take books out from the library, if law enforcement is allowed to look at your borrowing history. And that even extends to minors. So parents aren't allowed to get access to the books that their own kids are taking out. So a library card, even though it's only a 7-digit number, the history tied to that library card is shockingly secure. Okay, with all of those tangents aside, these are all really great questions, and I actually had a somewhat related to the blog project tangent planned for tonight that we will get to in a second. But before we do, any other questions at this point? We do have one more session of How to Adult coming around the corner. The plan right now is to have Ryan come in tomorrow and Wednesday to do a more secure version of authentication using something called Clerk, which is a authentication system. However, he did message me tonight at 5 and saying that he was feeling under the weather. So we are hoping that he will be feeling better tomorrow. If not, you are stuck with me for the rest of the week, and hopefully he will be able to come in next week and do Clerk. So that's where we're headed. Hopefully he will be in tomorrow. If not, you're stuck with me. I don't know if there's another open hack around the corner, but we are off next Monday for Labor Day. So no class next Monday. With all of that said, any general questions about the job market, about where we're headed, about things that we've been learning, about anything that you want to pick my brain, now is the time to do so. Go ahead, Terry.
Well, I mean, it's not really a question related to those things, but it's more like a question like you would you would think our government would what the whole social security like number, you would think it would be like more secure and like data not getting breached and stuff, but yet it's like this happens. So like I'm just trying to understand like how like
Yeah.
why
So
like
here's the problem. Other countries give you an ID number that is not meant to be secure. So they give you, when you are a citizen in, let's just say, Germany, right? When you get a ID card, whether it's a passport or a driver's license or a non-driver's license or whatever it is, that ID card is probably issued or is part of a national system. So when you get that driver's license, it has an ID number on it. And that ID number is not meant to be secret. It is meant that you can give it to anyone else and that employer can look up your information and be good to go. Social security numbers were meant to be secure. It was meant that you only used your social security number with the federal government, right? So not for anything else. It was, hey, I've turned 65 or 72 or whatever age you start collecting Social Security. Here's my number. Start sending me a check. The problem is that there was no other alternative for a unique identifier for a U.S. citizen or for anyone in the country, right? No classes this upcoming Monday. You are correct, Anwar. What happened instead is they said, oh, well, we do have unique identifiers, but they're based state by state. So it is entirely possible that my driver's license in New York has the same identifier number as a driver's license in Connecticut or California or Maine or somewhere else, because all of those state systems don't talk to each other. And that actually has been the case all the way up until Real ID became a standard, and still has not been rolled out and required when you travel on TSA. By the way, if you don't know what Real ID is, and if you fly with your driver's license regularly, look into Real ID. Next year, you won't be able to fly with your driver's license unless it is Real ID. So side tangent, won't go down that rabbit hole. So when all of these banks were like, well, we need a unique identifier to figure out that who this person is, they said, well, the only unique identifier that we really have is a social security number. Well, those numbers were always meant to be private. They were only ever meant to be used with the government. And so all of these different banks had started to use social security numbers because they were the only unique identifier Americans had. And now, because of that, we are dealing with consequences of, well, what happens when that leaks? So the problem with the system was that it was meant to be a private number that started being used outside of the government, and that's why it has leaked. The other major problem with the credit system in the US is that TransUnion, Equifax, and Experian make money off selling your credit data. So Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion, while they are governed by the federal government, they do not make money off of you as a consumer. They make money off selling your credit data to banks who are trying to make money off of you. That's a major problem. And believe it or not, our country actually has one of the biggest credit systems in any other country. China is having a big problem right now where they are having a problem assessing Chinese citizens' credit worthiness. So when they apply for a credit card, how much money can we give them? Because they don't have a federally recognized credit system. So it is a problem that other countries are dealing with, but it is something that, because our system, like private insurance is also heavily regulated. But the big problem there was Social Security numbers were always meant to be secret, and have been used for things other than that because we don't have any good alternative. That is a great note. DMV has a booth at the fair this year to help fairgoers get their real IDs if anyone is planning on going soon. I think May 2025 is the deadline. So you can't fly with a driver's license that does not have a flag or a star in the top right of it in New York State. So if you look at your driver's license and it doesn't have that, or if you've gotten it recently and it says not for federal ID purposes, that means you do not have real ID, and you need to go to the DMV, renew your license, and you need 2 proofs of address, whether it's a lease or a utility bill or cell phone bill or something that has your address on it. They're not too picky about what it is. But I think it's $30 more to get an enhanced license and maybe 20 more for real ID. But basically they just have to scan it all in. Don't quote me on those prices. What, Terry?
But like, okay, so I have like 2 questions. So like, okay, so my first question was, you notice like what our ID have like expiration date, like mine's like expired like the next 2 years. Why does our ID have an expiration date when our social security card doesn't have like an expiration date? That don't make sense. Isn't the ID is literally used to identify like who we are? Like it's just I don't know. This is dumb.
It is dumb. It is extremely dumb. And yes, we should. The idea there is that you're supposed to have one identifier that's tied with you for life. But you need a federal system to do that, right? And so that Social Security is a federal system, and that's why they hijacked that ID, because it was easier to use the ID that was already issued than it was to get all 50 states to get on board with the system, which is why it took Real ID a decade and a half to actually roll out. And it's still not completely federalized, but at least there are requirements that everyone is complying with. And yes, Joe, I did happen to know the SSN cards used to say explicitly not for identification purposes, which is to your point, Terry, of just because I have a cardboard card that has a 9-digit number typed on it and my name does not mean that I should be able to use this for identification because it doesn't have my photo on it. It doesn't have my date of birth on it. All it is a number that's typed onto a card, right? And it is so easy to forge a social security card. It is ridiculous. In addition to saying not for identification purposes, it used to explicitly say, don't use this number for anything other than Social Security communications. And that has since disappeared from the cards, for obvious reasons, because so many systems do use it. So yeah, don't forget to get your Real ID or an enhanced ID. An enhanced ID is Real ID compliant. But if you use your ID to board a plane, because TSA is a federal agency, you will need either an enhanced license or a Real ID in order to fly starting in May.
Yeah, and that was like my second question. Like, what's the difference between an enhanced and a real ID? Because right now I have like I have a permit, so I don't like understand like the difference. So.
Yeah, so the enhanced will let you get into Canada without having a passport if you're traveling by car. So the enhanced is basically like a mini passport, but only for Canada and only if you're entering by car. The real and all enhanced are real IDs. So if you have an enhanced license, you're good to go. A real ID is still requires the 6 points for identification, but also requires 2 proofs of address. And as long as you have that, the real ID doesn't look any different except it's got the star in the top right corner of the license. And that just means that you're allowed to fly with it. And then you can get a not for federal ID purposes, which is like the non-real ID still, but you just can't fly with it or use it to enter nuclear facilities. in case that's on your bucket list at some point. You can't fly out of the country with an enhanced driver's license. You can only use it at land border crossings. I think it will actually also get you into Mexico. But it has to be enhanced. Real ID itself is not alone. It does have to be an enhanced license. And border crossings only. And Joe, that's what I think most countries, well, I guess a lot of countries do passports. We're one of the lowest first world countries with citizens that have a percentage that have a passport. By the way, passports, you can now finally apply online. You don't need to go to the post office, which is absolutely apeshit that was a thing for years.
Do I get to choose my picture?
You can upload a picture. You do not have to mail in a picture. You can take your picture. You're not allowed to Photoshop it. It's got to be on a neutral background. But I filled out all of my paperwork to renew my passport online, and a week and a half later, it was sitting in my mailbox. So kudos that we finally have an online system that is not apeshit antiquated that you have to go to the post office. Okay, off topic, is there a chance there's a mentorship program available or additional support after the end of this program? So the only formal thing that we have is me offering one-on-ones, 30 minutes a month, and it's really up to you guys to decide what you want to fill that 30-minute one-on-one with. We did try and get a mentorship program off the ground, and I completely dropped the ball on that. So we will have a list of mentors for you guys at the end of the program. If you do want to reach out to them, they are all in Slack. So you can say, hey, I'm a graduate of the program. Here's what's going on. By any chance, do you have time to meet with me for mentorship or for a one-on-one? And Laura will also cover how to identify people in industry who may also be willing to mentor you there. So the only formal thing that we have on the books, and you also can reach out to Laura after the program ends, and get some advice there. We aren't paid after this program, and we are out of funding for any future cohorts as well. So we are actively looking into other grant opportunities, a couple other funding revenues. But because we've always had that kind of next cohort lined up, we've been able to roll additional hours after this cohort into support for alumni and graduates. So we are actively looking for funding that will make it easier to support one-on-ones and mentorship after the program. But we will provide a list to you of people who signed up for the mentorship program that we never got off the ground, that you guys can definitely reach out to on Slack and say, hey, I'm a graduate, looking for advice, and go from there. All right, any other questions for this evening? You now know that I'm a great person on a trivia team because I know the most random bullshit about everything, but you throw something my way and I'm happy to chime in. Okay. Before we go on break, let's go do attendance. Attendance secret word for tonight is real ID. REAL space ID. Could have made it enter your social security number, but I know better than to have that liability on HackUpstate. I certainly have watched a CGP Gray video on social security numbers show.
I could hear it. I knew where that obscure knowledge comes from because I have also seen that video.
So the crazy thing is that social security numbers, I promise this is the last random tangent I will go on. The first 3 digits were assigned to like a hospital or area, and then the next 2 digits were based off of the month you were born, and then the last 4 digits used to be sequential. So my dad, my grandmother lost my dad's social security card, but she also lost like all of the kids' social security cards. So when she reapplied to get like the social security numbers issued to her, and this is back in like the 60s probably, when they gave the social security cards, it started with the same first, all the same digits except for the last 2, and the last 2 were sequential based off of birth order. So my dad's older brother got 01, he got 02, and my dad's younger brother got 03. So all of their social security numbers are 1 digit apart, which is absolutely crazy to think about, that all of the people that I went to high school with, who also were born in likely the same hospital that I was born in, within the same year-ish period, had all the same 5 digits of the social security number, which is just utterly staggering at how insecure that is, because chances are out of the 300 people that I graduated with, I could get the first 5 digits of, I don't know, probably 70% of their social security numbers, assuming they didn't move and were born in the same period I was, because we were all in the same grade. Which is just mind-blowing to me of how insecure that is.
I think they just finally changed that in like 2011.
They did, yes. But still, but 2011, think about 75 years of insecure social security numbers, and that's what we are still dealing with for identity fraud and all of that. So if you see any massive security vulnerabilities with that system, for the love of God, please go freeze your credit. And if you're married or have a partner, your partner's credit. And believe it or not, I have frozen my niece's credit, who are only 4 and 2, because they have social security numbers too, and they are susceptible to fraud as well. So just please go freeze your credit. It takes 15 minutes, and save your password, and you'll be good to go, and make me happy.
Okay, but like, where do we go to freeze our credit? Do we do it online? Do we call?
You can do any of the above. Online is the easiest. Just Google Experian credit freeze, Equifax credit freeze, and TransUnion credit freeze. Oh, and apparently I'm zoomed out into the abyss now because okay. So use Google those 3. It is free to do. The only thing that will happen is if you don't have enough credit history, or they don't have enough security questions on you, they will take you to a section of their website where you have to fill out a form, print it out, and send in a copy of your ID, and then just mail that in. But you can normally do it online. If for whatever reason they don't have enough credit background on you, they will make you fill out a form and mail it in. Zoom back in there. Seems more interactive. Yeah, I'm playing around with a new camera, and it can do all kinds of weird stuff and like follow me as I move, which is really trippy with the virtual background, but kind of fun.
Is it physically moving, or is it zoomed out and focusing in?
It's physically moving. It's got a pan, tilt, and a rotating base.
That's wild. I thought you had your iPad or your iPhone connected as your camera.
No, although those definitely can do that. Okay.
Where do you get it from?
It's they used to be called PTZ cameras. But this isn't the exact one, but it's from the same company. That's what I am kind of using. But love-hate relationship with it right now, so jury's still out if I'm going to keep it. Okay, last thing we're going to do before we go on break, and I promise we are going to get back to not writing code, but code itself on the second half of class. I am going to launch a poll, and this poll is completely anonymous. So go ahead and vote in the poll, and then you can go on break, be back at 7:20 after you have voted in the poll. Completely anonymous. I don't know who's voting for what. Already not the results I was expecting. Vote in the poll, go on break, be back at 7:20. Recording. Give everyone a second to get back from break here. So, what do you guys think the results of the poll were? Think it was a bell curve? You think everyone answered the same thing? You think we had people either ends of the spectrum? I was prepared for a little bit more of a bell curve. Instead, we ended up with this.
Yeah, that was my guess right there.
So, why is this important? Why am I asking you guys this? Well, one thing, the blog project's really important for capstones, right? Because chances are there's something in the blog project that you can relate to your capstone of, hey, I need the ability to add this new item to my database. That's one thing, right? Or hey, I need the ability to delete things in my database, or I need the ability to click click on something and get more details about it, or I need the ability to add comments, right? Which is, did we do comments yet? I don't think we've done comments yet in blog. Or, oh, I need the ability to relate data together. I need to be able to have a signed in user and store the information about that one particular user that's signed in. Okay, well, I just listed like 19 different things this blog project is doing, but if we're overwhelmed on any one of them, all of a sudden the entire project feels overwhelming, right? And you're like, okay, yeah, I understand the code and I was able to follow along with him and everything is working, but there's a big difference between writing what someone else has written and being able to debug it and fully understanding it, right? And so that's what I want to spend the rest of the class doing. This, however, is kind of a new approach for me. I haven't done this before, right? Because we're normally in this mindset of more projects, more projects. Let's do another one. Let's do another one. And over time, you'll learn enough about it that you'll just be able to do it on your own, right? Well, I don't think that that's a good approach at this point in the boot camp, right? So I want to take a step back. I want to list out all the different concepts that we have done in the blog project. And then I want you guys to go in the code, find different sections of it, and go explain this. Because what we've done in the past and what's worked up until this point is let's go through line by line, let's number everything out, let me type in my explanation for it. But we've reached the point of complexity in this project that there are so many things to do that we don't really want to understand it from the line by line perspective. We want to make sure that we're getting those kind of overarching concepts of the blog project, right? So I'm going to start out by listing out the different concepts that we've done in the blog project, from project setup through authentication to connecting to the database, all of that kind of stuff, the high level outline of the project. Then I want you guys to dive into the code and go, you know what, it's 4 that I don't really understand, right? Where did we do this? Let me find that in the code. And we will use that list as a starting point to ask questions. The other thing I would like to do as I'm answering those questions is sometimes we don't learn very well auditorily, right? So we're following the steps, we're able to get it working, but we don't really understand it yet. And no matter how many times I type that out, no matter how many times I explain that out, the light bulb may still not be going off for you, right? And it's one of those situations where I think sometimes you hear the answer and you're like, I understand what all of those words mean, and I still don't know what that sentence means altogether, right? And so I want to kind of just pump the brakes in class tonight. We are going to do comments. We are going to do edit posts. That's coming. If Ryan's in tomorrow and Wednesday, I'll do that on Thursday. We're not completely done with this project, But if you guys are all at that 3 level of understanding, it doesn't make any more sense to keep plowing ahead, right? And keep on throwing examples and examples your way when this one example may be enough to get that light bulb moment out. Joe said, for me, it's marrying the concepts before I have a grasp on how to complete each individual concept. Practice them individually might help make me feel more comfortable. Yeah, so one thing we can do is after we brainstorm this list of like the different sections of the code, we can break that in and go, hey, number 3, can you give me an idea of how I can do number 3, right? And I can be like, you could do that in a to-do list app. You could do that in a social media app. You could do that in like whatever it is, right? And just give you some ideas of, oh, how can I practice that over and over again to get better at that one particular concept? So I'm going to start by firing up a Google Doc that you guys have access to. Just call it that. And share this. And anyone with link. And throw this in the chat.
Do you want us to be able to comment or anything?
No, I just did view only access on that, but if you guys have any feedback, I'm happy to update it for you guys. Okay. So with that said, you should feel free to come off mute and comment or throw it in the chat as we're brainstorming this list, where if you're like, he put a phase on the list and I just don't even know what that one thing even means, definitely comment at that point. Okay, so we're going to start with where we started. So think all the way back to last week. I don't even know what day we started the blog project. I should probably tell you that. We started the blog project all the way back last Wednesday. What's the first thing we kind of did on the blog?
We created a backend.
Yeah, so we had to do backend setup. And if we think about the backend setup, let's break that down a little bit further because I think that is too broad, right? So we have to set up Express. We probably installed npm installed packages. Before we even installed the packages, we set up npm and index.js or server.js, right? So let's say file creation. We had to set up Express. That was importing packages. That was doing our first server.get. That was server.listen. We could break these down even further, but we're trying to get like a high level here, right? So once we get Express set up, what's the other major part of the database? Give you the freaking answer. We also have to set up the database, right? We have to, I'm just going to put in parentheses here, package.json here. So set up database, that is going to be with SQLize and Postgres. We're going to have to say create database in Beekeeper. And after we set up the database, what's the other major step with the database that we have to do?
Link the two of them.
Yeah, I kind of consider that SQLize setting up. But the other thing I was going to say is create first model and confirm success, right? So, hey, once we get that model created, once we get it flowing through DB, we need to go into Beekeeper, make sure that that is there and keep going. So that's what I consider backend setup, right? So at this point, you should be able to say, all right, out of these steps, I can go back to Wednesday's video. And I think it was the second half of Wednesday's video. And I can start going through the setup steps, right? Pausing here, not saying that you need to go in, not saying that you need to find that section of the code, but looking at these steps alone, is there any part of this where you're like, I don't know what that is? Can you give me a definition of this thing? I think we did this other step that I don't see on the list. Pausing here for any questions you have about any of this.
Would you be able to include in this the terminal command?
Yep. So here we've got npm and autocorrect hates Google Docs. So don't expect the casing to be perfect. But we've got npm init-y here. That is going to create package.json. And then for installing the packages, we're going to do npm install pg sequelize cores and express. Feel like I'm missing one on that list. I may be okay there. And then setup express is putting things into our index.js file. And then the database is going to be our db.js file. And then this is going to be name of model.js. Other questions I have here. Terry, you have a question, but you can't get it out of your mouth.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of how to form like the question. Like I understand like the first three bullets. It's just the last two bullets is kind of what's I want to say confusing me, but it's more like I mean like getting like a head start on it.
Yeah. So let's anchor that in some actual code. So let me pull up. And some of this is based off of how you learn the best, right? So if you are learning from, if you watch the video again and you get another light bulb moment from it, and then you watch it again and you get another one, keep doing that. But I'm not trying to like toot my own horn here. If you're watching the video and you're like, I didn't get it in class and I didn't get it when I'm watching the video, don't keep on trying something that doesn't work for you, right? So at that point, say, you know what? I'm going to go to GitHub and I'm just going to read the code. And I'm going to go to the messages app because we commented all of that through, and I'm going to try it that way, right? And see if that clicks for you. If that doesn't click for you, copy and paste this entire file into ChatGPT and say ELI5, right? And have it explain it to you, because that may be the click moment for you. Or go on YouTube and say, hey, I want to go find the video with the most upvotes on, or the most views on how to set up Express, and go down that rabbit hole, right? Lots of different ways that you can take about this approach. Good question in the chat. Can you explain the difference between Sequelize and Postgres? I will come to that next. So Terry was saying, I get these first three. That all makes sense. How do we set up the database and create the database in Beekeeper? Well, the second one is the easiest, right? So when we go into Beekeeper, because we are setting up a new project from scratch, we want a new database in this dropdown, right? We want to keep all of the tables separate so that the users from our blog project don't overlap the users from, say, our messages app. So what we have to do to set up the database is actually pretty easy. All we do is go into Beekeeper and we type in create database, the name of the database, and hit run selection. And that's all we need to do for the second part of create the database in Beekeeper. The other half of that is a little bit more involved, right? So setting up the database with Sequelize and Postgres, that's our entire db.js file. So that is doing the import to pull it in from Sequelize. That is making the instance to connect to our database, including the name of the database that we just created in Beekeeper. That's setting up our models here, which is really the last step here. This is kind of our boilerplate code, right? That we say, hey, connect to the database. If there are any issues here, let's authenticate and make sure we catch them and know it's a problem before the server turns on. And then finally, let's export those models out so that in our index.js, we can get access to them up here. So this set up the SQLize in Postgres is basically saying, hey, go build out the basic db.js file, which will get obviously more complex as we add in additional models. But you want to break this apart, because if you try and do your first model at the same time as setting up the database, you could think that there's a problem with the model when in fact it's a problem with like connecting to the database itself, right? So that's why I break those steps apart and say, hey, let's just connect to the database and make sure we can get connected to the DB to come out. And then once we do, we can go create our first model.
And the endpoint under line 6 is the one from the database in Beekeeper.
Correct. The name blog here lines up with the blog right here. Okay, good on that, Terry. Any follow-up questions?
Nothing comes to mind. So
cool. So good question. Can you explain the difference between SQLize and Postgres? Absolutely. So Postgres is the database server itself. It is the variant of SQL that we are using. And we have multiple databases inside our Postgres server, right? So you see that drop-down list there. Those are all individual Postgres databases. In the first project that we did, we connected to Postgres directly using the PG package. The PG package required us to write out select star from messages, right? Or required us to write out that SQL statement. So PG is the node package that allows us to connect to Postgres directly and execute SQL statements. SQLize is like the level up from the PG package directly. So SQLize works with almost any SQL database variant, including Postgres, MySQL, Microsoft Server, Oracle SQL Server, couple other big ones out there, right? But SQLize works with any one of them. The difference is SQLize is an ORM, an object relational mapper. And what that is allowing us to do is when we define the model of what the database tables look like, what SQLize is doing is taking it a step further than the PG package does. It's saying we can take a JavaScript object and map it into the relational database query, or we can take the results of a relational database query and map it into an object. So SQLize is doing everything the PG package was doing for us, but it's doing a little bit more and allowing us to write our database queries by just using JavaScript without having to write out SQL. Any follow-up questions on that?
Yeah, I put something in chat that kind of applies to that and how I'm thinking about it. I put in is
yeah, go for it.
Postgres or the server is the waiter, the info in the database is the food. And I guess to tack on additionally, SQLize can be thought of as like the method on which how you're communicating to the waiter. Is that a bad analogy or incomplete?
No, that's a decent that's I mean, in terms of that analogy, that's fine. I'm trying to adapt it a little bit and think about it as like the data itself is sitting in the refrigerator and the Postgres, the data is the food in the refrigerator. Postgres is the refrigerator itself. Sequelize is the method that is Sequelize is the one that is finding the food inside the refrigerator, and then Express is the one that is serving up that data to the customer. That's on my feet, so not necessarily the best analogy, but in keeping in line with food, I don't know if that helps at all. So the other way to think about this, and let's just so I'm gonna go diagrams.net, and we're going to do a new diagram. And we're gonna say, all right, the end user is here. They are interacting with Chrome, your web browser. Chrome has your React front end in it. Your React front end is going to go talk to Express. And it is going to go from here to here with fetch. And this fetch is going to return back out JSON. Well, that was a fail. So React goes out to Express and does this fetch. Actually, it's going to do a fetch to a specific endpoint. That endpoint is going to return JSON. Okay, well, where does this JSON get the data? There's going to be a Postgres server here. Inside Postgres is the blog DB. This is like the Postgres server. And imagine the blog DB itself being like a folder inside the database, right? It's grouping all of our tables. And so inside the blog DB, there will be all of our individual tables. So what is Express doing? This endpoint is using Sequelize to go to the blog DB and get the data. And it is returning from the table back to the endpoint an object. That we take that object and we send it back via the JSON. Now, the only difference is Express, when it first turns on, it's not waiting for the endpoint to run before it uses Sequelize. It is going to do Sequelize setup to make sure the tables are all in sync. Then everything's good to go. So when the end user comes in, the end user fires up React. React does a fetch to the Express endpoint. The Express endpoint uses Sequelize and the models and the database connection to go to the Postgres server, go into the blog DB, and use the Sequelize model to get to the right table. The table then returns an object using the model to the endpoint. The endpoint can do whatever it wants to with it and sends it back via JSON to the fetch that requested it. So we can think about this as the rec and this as the res. Joe.
Would just like to point out that this is very helpful. But at what point is sequelize being set up or initialized?
When the Express server turns on.
Okay.
So this endpoint does not run until the request is made by React or by someone on some front end somewhere. So this cycle doesn't happen until this fetch gets made. But the second that the server turns on, so I'm gonna say, I don't know, server turn on is going to go find the sequelize models and it is going to sync them with the blog DB tables. I'm sure I would get beat over the head by one of my professors who's like, that's not the right icon to use for a process or some dumb BS. But hopefully that gets the point across of this has to be up and running and on first before any request can be made to it. Well, part of the boot up process, right? Like we know we have in index.js, we have the server.listen down here. That's what's saying, hey, once we turn this on, once you know about all the endpoints, keep this running in the background on 3001 for incoming requests. But before it can even listen on 3001, it imports this DB file. Well, this DB file has this thing called connect to DB. Connect to DB gets called right here and uses the connection from up here. So on boot, before we even listen for any requests, we end up connecting, authenticating, and syncing. And so this process really happens first. The server turns on, it reads about the models, it calls the sync and well, authenticate first and then sync. That sync is what's going to go to the BlogDB, build out these tables if they don't already exist. And then when this process happens, the Sequelize already knows about the models up here. The tables are already built, so it knows how to build this object based off of these models. I don't know if that helps at all or just makes it more confusing. Other questions about just this step of the process? We haven't done anything on the front end. This is just back end setup.
Can I get a copy of this diagram?
Nah, I'm gonna burn it when I'm done.
No.
Yeah, you can always screenshot things in the middle of a screen share. So if you do Command Shift 4, that gives you a little crosshairs, and then you can just drag over the section of the screen that you want a picture of. And I will also post this. This is not obviously my prettiest diagram, but I think oftentimes, and the reason why I wanted to do this is because so many times when you're learning, you need to be able to convey a technical concept to a non-technical person. Right. And so could I have had these diagrams pre-built and just show you during class? Yes. But there's something to be said about going through the code and going, all right, this clearly is not sinking in for you guys entirely, right? We got a 3 out of 5 on understanding. I'm not that terrible of a teacher, but we're not at those 4s and those 5s yet, right? And so being able to dive into a diagram like this and say, let's just draw it out, I'm hoping is pushing you guys beyond that 3 level of understanding. Whether it is a diagram, whether it is a outline breakdown, whatever it is, we want to push that level of understanding and go, this isn't all about code. Now, 19 weeks into the program, what is it going to take for that last 10% of technical knowledge to soak in? And that's when we want to use all the different approaches here. A checklist you want to be careful with. This can kind of be turned into a checklist over time. Everyone's capstone's obviously a little different, and the order that you do your capstone may be a little different. But in general, to-do lists and checklists are, you will never hear me say don't do a checklist. The only thing you'll hear me say is don't go overboard on a checklist and have it so detailed that it's just quicker to do the task than it is to have the item detailed out on your checklist, if that makes sense at all. But yes, checklist is a good idea. Okay, any questions about the back end setup?
I tried practicing on my own. Well, like with my capstone, and I got like an error on mine, but I'm gonna try to debug it.
Yeah,
Because
debug it, and we have an review week coming up. So yeah, try and debug it, and you guys know you're always welcome to send me errors in Slack with whatever file the send me the error, send me the stack trace, and then send me the file itself that it says the error is in. And I can help debug from there. I am going to ask one more question before we leave this. Did anyone get a light bulb moment from this diagram that they want to share? Because I think when you have those light bulb moments, other people may have the dimmer set to 90% and just need to hear someone else that had that light bulb moment what it was. So if any of you guys have a light bulb moment on this or anything else that we do, not only for the rest of the class, but the end of the cohort, if something clicks, if something goes, I wasn't getting it and I'm suddenly getting it now, share that in the chat or share that, come off mute and go, something just clicked. This is what clicked for me.
I wouldn't say it was super dramatic of a light bulb moment, but it definitely helps me understand in what order to do things a little bit better.
Cool. Okay. So let's go back. Once we get the back end set up, right? And it's important to note here that this is database and API Express server, right? We're doing kind of a lot there. And remember, whenever we're setting up Express, Express is a node framework itself. So when people are like, oh, what backend language do you use? And you're like, JavaScript. Some people may not know that JavaScript can be used in the backend. So when you say, oh, I use JavaScript in the backend, you can say I use a Node.js server, and the framework that I use in Node.js is called Express. So there's kind of a couple layers there. The other thing that I forgot to include here, Setup Express, including cores and JSON parser in server.use, right? We want to make sure that we're able to read the rec.body. We want to make sure we can make cores requests, all of that kind of stuff. Okay, now that we are done on the backend setup, that leaves us the front end setup, right? So we are going to open terminal and run npx create react app blog. We need to clear out the default files. We need to npm install react router DOM. Why do we need React Router DOM? Because by default, React projects cannot have multiple pages. So we install the router, so the router will route us to the correct components. npx npm there. This is npx create router blog, and then this is npm install react router DOM. So those are both the commands themselves, Joe. And yes, you do run them in the terminal. Both npx and npm are terminal commands. Okay. We need to set up the router in app.js. We need to create our first components that will be their own pages. And we need to create routes for those pages. Okay, what do I mean by all of that? Well, if we go look in our app.js here, in our app.js, we have to import the router. We have to create the router. We have to tell app.js to use that router in the router provider. And then we need to go create our routes. Well, we can't create those routes until we create components. And those components will start out empty, but end up being our home that returns just a div. And in my setup, what I like to do before I put anything on the page, before I move over any existing code that you may have, what I like to do is just do a div, do an ID equals home or an ID equals whatever the component name is. And then I put an H1 on there that says home. Then I'll do another H1 that says read post, and then another H1 that says create post. Because all I want to do is be able to test the routes in app.js. So I'm going to say create with H1 of page name, create routes, and then test routes by using URL bar. Then afterwards, I want to say, don't forget to do your npm start to get the project fired up. Okay, that is basic front end setup, right? We're getting the router going, we're getting the npm project set up, we're creating our first components that will be pages, we're creating the routes for them, and then we're testing to make sure that we can get to all of those routes. Pausing there. Anyone have questions? Anyone need a section anchored in the code? I don't know that I can create a beautiful diagram for that, but I could try if you guys have the understanding need for it. Feeling pretty good about all that? Okay. So from here, we've got to think about our oh, you know what? I also forgot. We can do add bootstrap to index.html as well, to public index.html, because we also need our bootstrap in there. Okay, if we're using it, not a requirement for capstones. All right, where do we go from the front end setup? Well, we probably want some data to show up on our page somewhere, right? But before we can get our data to show up, we probably need a way to be able to create the data in our database. So we're going to break this down into CRUD, which is create, read, update, delete. And so the first one we're going to say is create new post page. That is going to require the form and any inputs on it. Then we're going to say on submit. That is going to trigger the fetch. The fetch is going to use the request post and body include the values from the form. Okay, let me take a step back. Where do we do that? We go into new post. We have our form. In our form, we have our inputs. Our inputs are eventually going to get read in create post on form submit. Create form is going to go up here. It's going to extract out the title input content and values of those. It's going to grab our user ID from local storage, and then it's going to do a fetch with the post. Don't forget your application JSON, and then send in the post that we're using from right here. Pausing there. Any questions on the front end? Okay, so now we can do that all there. Cross the divide to the back end. So really important to understand that once this fetch happens here, this await keyword is going to pause. And nothing is going to happen in the front end until the back end sends something in. So all of the data right here in the body is going to line up in our index.js right here. So this post is lining up with this post. This URL posts here is lining up with this URL posts right here. This body right here, which is ultimately including this object, is lining up with this rec.body here. Where does this post line up to? This post is going all the way up to our db.js, which is ultimately pointing at this model right here. So when we send in the title, the content, and the author ID, it is ultimately lining up in two places. The title, the content, and the author ID are lining up on the front end, but where else are they lining up? They're also lining up in Beekeeper. When we look at posts, the structure of this shows the title, the content, and the author ID. So just like in our diagram, where the Express server and the models relate to the front end, they also relate to the tables on the back end. So really think about your Express server as being the middle person between what's happening in the front end and what's actually executing over in Postgres on the back end. So in our breakdown here, we go to the back end, we match posts URL, the method type, the request method type, let's say, and the body to the endpoint on the back end. So anytime that we have something here that's server.get, server.post, server.delete, any of those methods, that is an individual endpoint. So we're lining up the method, the URL, and the data in the body to the request coming from the front end, and the URL and the method are how the front end tells the back end, this is the section of code that I want to run. Pausing there for questions. Okay, so backend endpoint uses model.create to save the data from the rec.body into the Postgres database using SQLize. Then the backend endpoint sends a response to the front end request. No, it's going to drive one of you nuts unless I fix the spelling on that. Okay, now that I got the request back, what happens? We go back to the front end. The front end then redirects us to the home page. And I am going to indent all of this. Once we get to the home page, what happens? We then go into read from the database. Reading from the database takes us into home.js. This use effect then comes in and goes, oh, I need to make another GET request. So we say from homepage, run use effect. So we can make an API call when the page loads. That's this use effect here. Use effect is really important. We can't make an API call without the we can't make an API call and store data in state without the use effect. It triggers an infinite loop. So it is important to say, hey, when I want to make an API call request, when the page loads in React, I have to do the use effect. We can further request in the body using object notation rec.body. Yes, you are correct, Joe. You don't have to use the entire body. You can break it apart because the server.use express.json parser is breaking that object out entirely. So you can use dot notation, bracket notation, and nest several layers down if you wanted to.
Would there be a reason to use one of those methods? Does it not really matter as far as I guess managing resources or whatever? Like, should you be aiming to only pull or access what you're intending to?
Yes, yes, for sure. And it's actually pretty rare that your front end request is going to have the fields named exactly the way that you wanted to. So it is very common to see instead of in our rec.body, instead of like creating the whole thing, instead you'll see someone who's like, oh, user ID actually maps to rec.body.author ID. Like that's a very common thing to see there. That our model doesn't actually look like this, but it is very common to see something like that. Either only using parts of the body that you care about, or mapping the incoming field name to something different on the database side.
So in other words, usually try to be as specific as possible.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. In this case, because we were like, oh no, everything is perfect on the front end, we just want to throw all three of those fields into the database. It's fine to use the rec.body, but it's pretty rare to see the entire body being used. You would normally break that out. Okay, so on the front end, the use effect goes and makes request to backend server get posts. That is right here. We then go to backend, line that up with the server.get right here. That server endpoint is going to use Sequelize to not only get the posts, but also use a relational query to include the user model. What do I mean by that? We not only go to the database, which is defined as a Sequelize model, and get the post out, we also include the user information, which is going to use a table join to get the first name and last name of the user who created that post. How does the database know that the post has a related user? Because in db.js, we tell it the post belongs to a user by using the author ID that is the foreign key. So by setting this up in advance, we can tell Sequelize how to execute that join query. Joe.
So just to recap, in order to join any tables, you need to define it there, I guess, where you're initializing the database.
Correct. You can actually do it at any time before you run the query itself. So it doesn't have to be before you initialize, but it's a good idea to do it before you initialize. Okay. So in index.js, remember, when we do this post.findAll, we are basically asking Sequelize, go write the SQL query for me to select out the post and go do all the stuff that we did at Khan Academy, right? Select star from post, where the post ID is equal to this thing, or inner join the user where the post.author ID equals the user.id. all of that SQL is getting generated by our SQLize here, which is kind of cool. So use SQLize not only get the quotes, but use the relational query to include the user fields we care about. Send that data back in a res.json or in a res. So we send that response back. We go back to the front end here. And what do? We take those posts and we set them into state. So set resulting JSON into state. Why do we set things into state in React? Anytime that we have data that is either going to be updated by the user or is going to be set by the user, we use state in React. So when that data updates, React will react to the state change to show that information. So when we take the set here, it's going up here and updating this posts in state here. What does the posts in state do here? Well, we map over posts in state here. So because state is updated, we re-render the posts map to show the new data that came in from the API. From there, we take that data, post in state, and we send it into a prop. Now, you don't have to map over into a separate component. It is usually a good idea because if you're mapping over something, chances are you want to reuse that section of code, and that section of code could get pretty long, right? So I could copy this div all the way down to this closing div and throw it in right here. But I don't want to do that because that's a good section of code that I can just move out into its own file to make the code much easier to read, right? So when we are mapping over things, if it's a doinky little thing and we only have a couple lines of HTML, we don't need to move it into its own component. But if it's something like post preview, where this is substantially long, we do want to move that over. So over here in our map, we say send the data that's now mapped over to a separate component via a prop. And then in the separate component, make the data show up among our HTML. So we take the data from our map, we send that into post preview. In post preview, we get the post details, and then we use that data, whether we show the title directly or whether we do things like formatting the date right here. Okay, I'm going to stop there. We did handle login. We handled the read more button. We have a couple other things in here, but this is project setup, right? For your capstone, you have to have two things. You have to be creating items in the database, and you have to be reading items from your database. This flow handles all of that. Authentication is optional. Hell, even React is optional in your capstone. But in order to graduate with your full stack certificates, you guys need to be able to read from the database and create things in the database. The blog project alone is accomplishing that. These are the 19 gazillion steps that we are going through to make that work. So if you are feeling overwhelmed at this point, if you are going, I don't know where to start on my capstone, don't start at your capstone. Go read through these steps and go, can I find where in the blog project we're doing this? If I can find where in the blog project this particular step is and read it and understand it, I can go do that step in my capstone. If I don't understand it here, I'm not going to understand it in my capstone, and I either need to Slack Max and ask him what this means, to explain it in a different way, to make a different diagram. If I count on my fingers, my web camera zooms out and it's really weird. Okay, sorry. I feel like someone is like actually behind the camera, like, I'm sorry. Asking for help. Either say, can you explain this step another way? Can you give me an example of this code? Can you make a diagram for it? Can you point me in the right direction? I'm trying to do this step in my code this way and it's not working. All of those are perfectly fine, acceptable questions, right? So what you want to be looking at is, do I understand every single thing on this list? Because if you understand it on this list, you've got a much better shot of doing it in your project. But you don't want to start at your project. You want to start at, do I understand every single thing here? Pretty soon it's just gonna like pan to another part of the office and I'm just gonna be gone. You know, it's funny, it does do that when I go on break because it follows me. And so when I come back from break, the camera's pointing in the like the wrong direction, and I have to like go over here and like get it to follow me back. It's dumb. Okay. Hopefully this is a refreshing change to class, to writing code outright. I am going to take this picture and put it in this blog project breakdown at the bottom. So if you're looking for it, it is in here. Not the prettiest diagram, but you know what? Gets the job done. I'm going to stick around in case you guys have any questions. Otherwise, I hope to not see you until Thursday because Ryan is in tomorrow and Wednesday to do off. However, if he is sick, you are stuck with me and we will take up, edit a post, and maybe uploading a file to the database so that you can save an image in. And maybe seeding data from a file so you can use JSON in third-party data. I should write that stuff down. That's what's coming down the pipeline. Otherwise, have an awesome evening, and I will see you either tomorrow or Thursday. And I will stick around in case you guys want to read through this and ask any questions.
Yeah, I think it's there's just so much in that project and with the chat project, like so much going on that sometimes it's getting like lost in the sauce a little bit.
Yeah.
Is there like a what is it, free code camp, but for stuff on the back end, or even just like a list of like tasks or things that I can do? I mean, I can, now that we have this list, it's probably easier to do that, but
Yeah,
sometimes I don't know what to practice.
Go off this list. The annoying part about all of this is that it's like, once you get it in your head, you're like, oh, this is so simple, right? But then in order to like get the practice with it, you're like, there's so many little things that each individual thing is not hard, but then it's just getting in the practice of like doing all of those things, right? And then the other thing I will say is that like a good half of this, and probably even more, is like just project setup. And the annoying part of that is that when you're working in the workforce, they're going to have projects already set up for you. You're almost never going to have to create a project from scratch. And so that's kind of annoying as well, is you got to get the practice of doing all the setup stuff. But then every cohort, when I get to this, I'm like, I haven't started a new Express server from scratch since last cohort, where like we've got one Express server at work and it's got 40,000 lines of code in it. And we keep on adding new endpoints to it or changing the existing ones. But when you're like, hey, can you set up a new Express server and make sure that it's got the rec.body coming in from the JSON? I'm like, I gotta go look that up. Like, I haven't done that in a long time. And I wouldn't have those steps memorized. I would go look at another project I've already done to do that, or go right to the documentation and set it up that way. So there's no like de facto, the way that I set up Sequelize is going to be very different than someone else setting up Sequelize. And one developer using JSON, or one developer may go, oh, we use application form URL form encoded or something instead of JSON, because that's like the default the browser uses. We don't use JSON. Or so there's no like, even if I did have one resource to point you to and say go get practice here, there's more variety in how they're going to accomplish getting their front and back end set up.
Right. Yeah, I guess it's more of a skill to learn from somebody like going into a company with a running project to like, I'm assuming they have like documentation here, all of our endpoints and being able to read through those. Yeah. The other thing that I think I get tripped up on is, what method I'm using for what, not necessarily like what method I'm like post, delete. Those are all, the same things that you would use in SQL, but like server.use, when you're using that, the rest of those kind of methods, I think.
So Ryan's going to cover server.use a little bit more. Server.use is actually using a middleware, but we haven't described what middleware is yet. So it's not possible for you to fully understand them, other than like, oh, I'm telling the server to use that thing, but you don't know how it's using that thing yet. So it's kind of hard to wrap your head around, if that makes sense at all. But there is probably a list of 1,000 different Express middlewares you can use, and I've probably used 10 of them.
Right.
Like, yeah, cores and body parser, that makes total sense. There's something called Multer, which is taking a multi-part file upload and kind of gluing them all back together. That's a very common one. There are a lot of authentication middlewares that you will use so that you can get secure access to rec.user. That's what Ryan will be teaching tomorrow. But then there's 1,000 other ones where I'm like, just have never had to use that, right? I've never had to have my API server process this one thing before it goes and runs my actual execution.
Alrighty. Yeah. I got one more question that's not on this topic.
Yeah.
So this is the only week that I have where I have nothing else going on other than careers and code. So every day this week I'm going to be working. I'm trying to like get as much of my project done as I can.
Yep.
I'm going to refactor some stuff because I cut a lot of features down to try and make sure that that the parts that I am doing are done well. Other than having dedicated spaces, how would you, I find a lot of times when I'm like in the zone of something and I get pulled out or I stop or something, it's like really, really hard to get back into that zone or something, or I'm like sidetracked or something.
So your question is, how do you maintain focus?
Yes.
Headphones and music are huge for me. For me, it's show tunes, and my boss knows I'm going to have a kick-ass day if I am listening to show tunes all day long. In terms of productivity, at least. Some people love music with lyrics in it. Some people can't do it and do like EDM. And that like really gets the BPM of the song matching your heart rate BPM. So I would say music is definitely important. Don't forget, like, when you take breaks, if it's you that's choosing to take the break, it seems to take you out of whatever you're working on less disruptively than if a interruption comes in. So like if you're like, I'm going to set a timer for an hour, and when the timer goes off, I'm going to write a inline comment of exactly what I'm working on, and then go take a 10-minute break, go to the bathroom, refill my water bottle, get a snack, and come back in. And because I ended on my terms, when I come back into it, it's much easier to like pick the focus back up. So that's one tip that I have. And then yeah, space is super important, right? So like if you're finding your bedroom doesn't work for you, or your dining room table doesn't work for you, like go down to common space, go to a library, go to a coffee shop, like get out of the house. That can be really helpful.
Alrighty, yeah. It's just sometimes, I mean, I have a programming playlist, and music is definitely what I use like in all of my stuff to be productive.
Yep.
Usually stuff that does not have lyrics in it. So I have a classical music playlist that has like movie soundtracks or legitimate classical music, and then I have like more EDM style music. Yeah, sometimes
The other really good one is like write down a goal and put it on a sticky note, so that like it's in sight, and so when you get sidetracked on something, you can like force your focus to the sticky note, either virtual or like actually on the side of the monitor, and go, no, this is the goal that I'm working on. Because that way, if you get distracted on whatever and you start going down a rabbit hole, you can anchor yourself on that goal. And then I would say your goal for this weekend should be like, hey, I gotta have a create and read working on one form. Because once I get it working on one form in one place, I'm going to be able to snowball that across all the other form types.
Alrighty, when's our next capstone check-in? Or is it not, are we not doing a capstone check-in until it's...
No, next one is September 5th. So next Thursday.
Next Thursday. And what are the requirements for that?
Create and read operations happening in the database from your front end.
Is it just, do we only need create and read for our project? We don't need update and delete? Or is that not a requirement? I'm going to put it in there anyway, but
it's not a hard requirement, but for the students who are just getting across the finish line, the create and read is enough. But we've had students who have had 40 endpoints, and we're scraping websites, and like at that point, everyone's website is just a little bit different. So we say backend project structure using Node Express, Postgres, and SQLize. Oh no, we do say at least one endpoint for CRUD operations. Integrate your custom API with your React front end. Last 4 weeks of the program are focused on Capstone and Creo. While you'll have all the knowledge at the end of week 21 to begin to execute on these requirements, you'll be working on your capstone up until the end of the program. So basically, just because it's the last check-in doesn't mean like it needs to be done by then. But yeah, we let people graduate if they have create and read working. We just want to make sure that you can do like 2 endpoints, 2 flows, understand sending data in and making the data show up. And then if you have update and delete working, great, but we're not going to like not let you graduate if you don't have that done.
This doesn't have to be answered right now, but it is my intention to potentially be working on this project, and I guess refactoring it into a more of a desktop application than a web application. Just because of the nature of like hosting. I mean, I guess it doesn't matter, but
you'd be
if it's
surprised
if it's cloud hosted.
You'd be surprised how many workplaces are going over to cloud hosted, because it's just so much easier to update and maintain.
For medical records?
For everything.
Really? All of our, we just had a meeting with